In the winter of 1940, as Britain stood alone against the strengthening power of Nazi Germany, the public understood the threat of U-boats prowling the North Atlantic. What they did not know, what almost no one outside a handful of naval rooms was permitted to know, was that the Admiralty had quietly activated a covert internal cell. Buried deep within the Naval Intelligence Division in London, this small team was tasked with examining cases of Allied ships sinking under conditions that did not match any confirmed enemy activity. Their existence was never acknowledged publicly, and even within the Navy few spoke of it. The war had created countless shadows. This one, however, was made deliberately. The struggle began with the growing chaos of early 1940. Britain's convoy system was still in its painful infancy, introduced only months earlier after Churchill's insistence that merchant losses were becoming unsustainable. Convoys required escorts, ships the Royal Navy already lacked, and the Admiralty had to prioritize which routes received protection. But even as new escort groups were deployed under Western Approach's command, a troubling pattern emerged. A handful of ships were vanishing despite being routed through areas where no U-boats were known to operate. Captain Andrew Prentice, who served with the Trade Division, noted in a private diary entry dated March 12, 1940, "Some sinkings do not align with known enemy disposition. Positions are uncertain, wireless logs incomplete. I fear a confusion we cannot afford." His entry, declassified decades later, suggested the anxiety mounting within the Admiralty. Each unexplained loss raised questions, not only about the enemy but about the Admiralty's own situational awareness in a rapidly shifting war. Historically, maritime conflict always involved uncertainties, storms, navigational errors, breakdowns in communication. But the unexplained sinking stood apart. Sailors aboard nearby convoys reported hearing no explosions, no distress signals, only the eerie absence of ships that had been present on their horizon minutes before. HMS WWII, a sloop assigned to escort duties between Liverpool and Halifax, wrote in its May 1940 patrol log that the crew had seen a flash on the deck of a freighter 2 miles distant, followed by nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, just empty sea. The Admiralty initially treated these cases as unfortunate anomalies, folding them into the general confusion of the Atlantic campaign. But the pattern persisted. Reports from Coastal Command aircraft, Bristol Blenheims and later Lockheed Hudsons, painted a similar picture. Patches of sea where a convoy ship was expected, but nothing remained. In some cases, the Admiralty incorrectly marked the losses as U-boat kills, even when decrypted German naval traffic from Bletchley Park showed no submarines within hundreds of miles. The insight that followed came quietly. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord, ordered a discreet internal investigation, one that would not appear in official wartime paperwork. Members of the small intelligence cell began comparing convoy logs, radio intercepts, and escort reports. They discovered discrepancies. Timestamps didn't align, logbooks reported last known positions that contradicted weather records, and wireless transmissions that should have been received weren't. A classified memorandum from June 1940 summarized their concern. Certain events within the Western Approaches remain unexplained. Operational mistakes cannot account for every occurrence. The memo was stamped secret and locked away. The wartime public would never hear of it. By August 1940, the investigation sharpened. One case, the loss of the merchant vessel SS Blairmore, stood out. The ship vanished between convoy checkpoints without sending a single signal. Hours later, an escort destroyer reported intercepting a weak Morse sequence that did not match naval code groups. Its origin was never established. Some believed it came from the Blairmore. Others argued it was atmospherics or interference from German shore stations. The Admiralty refused to release the recording. The reveal was unsettling. Several of the unexplained sinkings occurred in areas where the Royal Navy was testing new types of sonar and anti-submarine equipment. The Admiralty feared that releasing information about these losses might expose sensitive operations, or worse, highlight failures in technology still in development. But whether these incidents were accidents, navigational errors, or misinterpreted wartime confusion remained unclear. The files were sealed, their details known only to a handful of officers sworn to secrecy. Reflecting on these events today offers a sobering lesson. War is not simply a contest of armies but of information, what is known, what is believed, and what is hidden. In the fog of the Atlantic campaign, mistakes were inevitable. Yet the Admiralty's decision to classify these early cases created an enduring mystery that historians still struggle to unravel. As 1940 closed and Britain braced for the worsening Battle of the Atlantic, the Covert Intelligence Cell continued its work quietly, receiving yet more reports of vanished ships and contradictory logs. Their findings would soon collide with an incident so dramatic that even the Admiralty could not entirely bury it, a disappearance that would force the Navy to expand its investigation and deepen the secrecy surrounding it. And that event would come sooner than anyone expected, just months into the new year. By the summer of 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had evolved into a relentless test of endurance. Most histories focus on the U-boats tightening their grip on shipping lanes, but few mention the quieter, more unsettling reality that confronted the Admiralty. Ships were still going missing in ways that didn't match any confirmed submarine attack. The Western Approaches Command, established only months earlier and headquartered in Liverpool, became the center of Britain's efforts to regain control of the shipping routes. But behind closed doors, senior officers were dealing with a pattern no tactical chart could easily explain. The struggle intensified in June 1941, when convoy lost data began showing anomalies. Some ships vanished within heavily patrolled lanes, escorted by experienced crews trained in anti-submarine warfare. Other vessels failed to report routine position checks despite clear weather. At first, these incidents were attributed to operator error or simple mechanical failure, both common during wartime. Yet as more logs were examined, the gaps became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. U-boats were responsible for most Allied losses, but not these. HMS WWII, a Royal Indian Navy sloop assigned to the Western Approaches, recorded something particularly troubling in its patrol log on July 4. The ship had been escorting convoy OB-337 when crew members spotted a lone merchantman drifting off course. As WWII approached, signalers attempted to communicate using Aldous lamps. No reply came. Within minutes, fog swept across the horizon, shallow and quick-moving. When the haze lifted, the merchant ship was gone. No explosion, no debris, no plume of smoke. The sloop searched for nearly 5 hours, sweeping the area using Type 123 ASTIC equipment, but detected nothing. Even more concerning were the reports from RAF Coastal Command pilots flying Hudson reconnaissance aircraft from bases in Cornwall and Northern Ireland. Several crews noted abrupt gaps where ships should have been, moments where they expected to see convoy groups spread across the Atlantic but found only open water. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Philip Harcourt, wrote in his operations diary, "A single vessel vanished between morning and afternoon sweeps. No enemy sub in area per intel. Troubling absence." His entry was later redacted in official archives. The Admiralty's Internal Intelligence Cell, originally formed months earlier, now had more material than it could effectively process. Analysts compared convoy tracks, weather reports, and Enigma decrypts from Bletchley Park. Again and again, the same contradiction emerged. German naval communications did not support the assumption that U-boats were responsible for the missing tonnage. In fact, several decrypts explicitly placed U-boats hundreds of miles away from the positions the missing ships last reported. The insight that followed forced the Admiralty into deeper secrecy. In early August 1941, a series of inconsistencies regarding convoy SL-78 alarmed Western Approaches Command. 2 ships disappeared in daylight under clear skies, both within radio range of escorts. But the escorts heard nothing, no distress signals, no Morse sequences, no flares. HMS Rochester, a sloop patrolling nearby, logged, expected sighting at 1840 hours. Seacom. Ship absent. That line, short, clinical, was the only record of the disappearance. Historically, the Atlantic Ocean is vast and unforgiving. Ships break down, storms strike quickly, and wartime conditions amplify every risk. Yet the Admiralty could not ignore that many unexplained losses occurred in calm weather with experienced escort groups nearby. If these were navigational errors, they were remarkably consistent. If they were U-boat attacks, they were executed without torpedo trails, explosions, or radio traffic. And if they were operational failures, then someone in the chain of command was misreporting or suppressing data. The reveal came in October, when a set of sealed convoy logs was reviewed by an internal board. Pages were missing from multiple ships' wireless records, pages that should have contained routine broadband checks. In one case, the missing pages coincided with the exact hour a ship vanished. The Admiralty quietly sequestered those logs and issued new instructions. All future convoy records were to be hand-carried to Liverpool headquarters by officers with top-level clearance. Modern analysts sometimes attribute these wartime gaps to clerical chaos or the fog of war. And indeed, the Atlantic presented countless ways for information to go missing. But the Admiralty's decision to lock away these logs suggests concerns deeper than simple paperwork errors. What were they afraid historians might discover? Faulty equipment? Intelligence oversights? Or the uncomfortable possibility that the Royal Navy had misjudged the capabilities of both friend and foe? The part ends with a lingering unease. For by late 1941, morale in the western approaches was strained. Escort crews whispered about the disappearances. Pilots discussed them in the mess halls. And within the Admiralty, a sense of urgency grew. The next incident, the disappearance of an escort ship itself, would shake the Navy and force the internal investigation into its most secretive phase yet. That disappearance would arrive before the year was out. In November 1941, a single incident broke through the layers of silence the Admiralty had tried to maintain. 4 months, unexplained merchant ship vanishings had troubled analysts, but now the mystery reached the Royal Navy itself. HMS Stanley, a Flower-class corvette assigned to the defense of convoy HG-76, disappeared during an operation that should have been routine. Her loss was never fully explained, and the documents surrounding the incident, scattered, contradictory, and in some cases redacted, would become one of the most hotly debated naval enigmas of the war. The hook lies in the convoy itself. HG-76 was no ordinary formation. Departing Gibraltar on December 14, 1941, it sailed under the aggressive escort leadership of Commander F.J. Johnny Walker, the most successful U-boat hunter Britain had. Walker's 36th Escort Group included destroyers, sloops, and his own command HMS Stork. Accompanying him were other vessels like HMS Blankney, HMS Deptford, and the ill-fated corvette HMS Stanley. Walker's tactics were bold, coordinated, and revolutionary. Yet for all the precision of his escort strategy, Stanley's fate unfolded under circumstances that refused to fit any operational logic. The struggle began on the night of December 18th. The convoy was steaming northwest of the Azores, weather fair, visibility moderate. The group had already fought skirmishes with U-boat pack, Seerauber, sinking U-131 and damaging others. Spirits were high. But a series of radio inconsistencies marked the hours leading to the corvette's disappearance. According to the surviving USS Louisville signal logs, an American cruiser temporarily supporting Atlantic operations, Stanley sent routine coded position reports shortly after dusk. But the timing conflicted with British logs by nearly 40 minutes. At first glance, this was easily attributed to operator fatigue or time zone confusion. But later, investigators found something stranger. The final 2 signal entries attributed to Stanley did not match the handwriting of the corvette's wireless telegraphist. Someone else had written them. Insight emerged from a diary kept by Sub-Lieutenant Alan Hotham of HMS Deptford. He wrote shortly after the incident, "We heard no distress calls. No explosion felt. Only the absence of her lamp signal when she failed to check in. She was there then gone." Others say they saw a flicker on the horizon. This testimony contrasts sharply with Walker's after-action report, which simply declared Stanley lost to torpedo, presumed enemy action. But no one in the convoy, no escort ship, no merchantman reported seeing a torpedo track. No plume. No detonation. This contradiction formed the first reveal. If Stanley had been torpedoed, someone should have seen or heard something. Flower-class corvettes were lightly built, yes, but even they produced debris and oil slicks when destroyed. Searchers found nothing. Not a piece of timber. Not a life raft. Not a sound. The sea was calm, conditions rarely described in convoy battles, yet the Royal Navy lost an entire warship without a trace. The missing testimonies compounded the tension. 2 sailors aboard HMS Stork later claimed in private letters that they had been questioned by Admiralty officials in London days after the convoy returned to port. Their correspondence hinted at details they were told not to discuss: unusual signal interference on the night of Stanley's loss, a brief burst of static across the escort frequency, and the absence of acoustic signatures typically recorded by ASTIC operators in the moments following an attack. These letters were never entered into official naval archives. They surfaced decades later in estate papers. Yet the most troubling clue came not from witnesses, but from documentation. When HMS Stanley's wireless and deck logs were collected for the Admiralty review, several pages were missing. Only wartime censors could have removed them. Captains were required to submit logs sealed and intact. The gaps covered the same approximate window during which the corvette vanished. Analysts noted the coincidence, but the Admiralty classified all materials relating to HG-70SAX's losses for decades. Modern naval historians often propose conventional explanations: a misidentified torpedo track, a shock detonation that caused the corvette to break apart quickly, or perhaps an accidental magazine explosion. Each scenario fits some of the evidence but conflicts with other parts. No explanation fully accounts for the silence, radio, acoustic, and visual, that marked the ship's final moments. There is a broader application here, one that extends beyond wartime secrecy. In any conflict, institutions often prefer the narrative that reinforces competence and clarity. For the Admiralty in 1941, admitting uncertainty, let alone failure in the presence of their best escort leader, was unthinkable. Secrecy could have served multiple purposes: shielding technological vulnerabilities, protecting faulty protocols, or avoiding the morale damage that unexplained losses could inflict on a nation already stretched thin. The close of Part 3 leaves us with a question that still echoes in naval archives today. Did HMS Stanley fall victim to an enemy weapon, an operational error, or an incident the Admiralty consciously chose not to reveal? Whatever the truth, the disappearance forced intelligence officers to expand their investigation. And the evidence that soon surfaced from intercepted Enigma traffic and damaged escort ships would deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. For in early 1942, signals began arriving from the Bay of Biscay that hinted at contacts neither Allied nor German commanders could explain. By early 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a critical turning point. The tide had not yet turned in the Allies' favor, but British intelligence, fueled by Enigma decrypts and an expanding network of coastal patrols, was beginning to expose patterns in German U-boat operations. Yet amid this growing clarity, a series of Enigma intercepts arrived from the Bay of Biscay that seemed to undermine everything the Admiralty believed it understood. These signals referenced unidentified naval contacts, encounters that German captains themselves could not identify. And once again, the Royal Navy found itself facing events that defied straightforward military explanation. The hook began with an Enigma key change. On February 5, 1942, Bletchley Park's Hut 8 decrypted several messages from U-Boat Command, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, BDU. Among them were vague references to unknown surface forces, spotted southwest of Brest. At first glance, these could have been British escort ships or Free French patrols. But the coordinates were wrong, far outside normal Allied operational zones. Moreover, the U-boats reporting these sightings were themselves operating in patterns that didn't align with BDU's known patrol grids. The struggle to understand these anomalies landed squarely on the Admiralty's desk. The Bay of Biscay had long been a hotspot for U-boat transit, and Coastal Command regularly flew Bristol Beauforts and later Liberator patrols over the area. But if the Germans were encountering unidentified surface craft, the Admiralty needed to know whether these were Allied ships operating without coordination, or something else entirely. Confusion in operational waters during wartime is dangerous. Confusion in enemy transit zones is lethal. To investigate, the Admiralty quietly redirected elements of the 15th Escort Group, veteran crews who had recently been rotating through the North Atlantic corridor. Their flagship for this assignment was the sloop HMS Auckland, a vessel well-equipped for anti-submarine work with Type 124 ASTIC, depth charge throwers, and an experienced complement of officers. The group was instructed to sweep a broad arc off the Bay of Biscay, responding both to Enigma intercepts and to RAF sightings of unusual wake patterns reported northwest of La Rochelle. These sweeps were classified under the innocuous designation, routine intercept patrols, masking their true investigative purpose. The insight from the operation began on March 19, 1942, when Auckland picked up a brief but sharp hydrophone reading, an acoustic signature that did not match known German propeller frequencies. The contact lasted under 40 seconds before vanishing. The sloop executed a textbook search pattern, dropping 2 depth charges on the suspected bearing, but recovered no debris and no oil. Petty Officer James Latham noted in his notebook, "Sounded like a surface vessel engine cutting suddenly. Not submersible. Odd, very odd." His notebook was never included in the official patrol record. Matters escalated 2 days later. On March 21, during heavy swells, Auckland reported visual contact with a vessel described only as a low silhouette craft, moving at high speed across the horizon. The ship's silhouette did not match German torpedo boats, which typically operated closer to the French coast, nor did it resemble Allied trawlers or motor launches. The watch officer logged the sighting, but the page in question is heavily redacted in surviving copies. Shortly afterward, Auckland suffered abrupt mechanical damage, initially described as the result of a near-miss explosion, but later amended to unknown shock impact. Sections of her port hull plates buckled inward, as if struck by a pressure wave. This was the reveal that ignited debates within the Admiralty. If Auckland had been attacked, It was by a weapon or vessel none of the escorts could identify. The Germans were not known to deploy experimental craft in the Biscay corridor at that stage of the war, and even their fast E-boats would have struggled to operate so far from shore, especially without refueling support. Allied patrols, meanwhile, had reported no friendly vessels operating in the area. The internal inquiry that followed uncovered further discrepancies. Some of the original signals received from Bletchley Park relating to the German sightings were missing entire lines of text. Analysts at the Admiralty Signals Intelligence Division observed that several messages appeared to have been manually altered, either before translation or afterward. When questioned decades later, surviving codebreakers insisted they had not censored or modified the intercepts. The missing lines remain unexplained. Reflecting on this episode today, historians often propose explanations rooted in the fog of war: misidentified whale spouts, wake reflections distorted by atmospheric haze, or U-boat captains confusing Allied patrols for unknown threats. Yet these explanations feel insufficient when weighed against the physical damage done to HMS Auckland and the missing portions of the Enigma decrypts. The Admiralty, perhaps wary of exposing vulnerabilities in its signals intelligence process, classified the entire operation under a restricted file that remained sealed until the 1980s. The close of Part 4 leaves us once again suspended between evidence and omission. HMS Auckland limped back to Plymouth for repairs, her officers reluctant to discuss the events off Biscay. The Admiralty, now dealing with internal pressure, turned its attention to the one source of data that might clarify what was happening: the growing archive of U-boat logs decrypted at Bletchley Park. But those records would only deepen the contradictions. For by 1943, Allied code-breaking revealed unsettling mismatches between the German logs, British lost reports, and the official story of what had happened at sea. By 1943, the Allies were finally beginning to gain the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic. New escort carriers, improved radar, Hedgehog mortars, and long-range liberators were steadily closing the mid-ocean gap. With U-boat losses rising, British morale was cautiously improving. But inside the Admiralty and at Bletchley Park, analysts were wrestling with a different problem, one that threatened to undermine the clarity the Allies believed they had achieved. The deeper they dug into decrypted German U-boat logs, the more they discovered glaring mismatches between what the Germans recorded and what the Royal Navy believed had happened at sea. The hook of this chapter begins on an ordinary day at Bletchley in Hut 4, the Naval Intelligence Center. On April 9, 1943, an Enigma decrypt arrived containing U-572's patrol notes for late March. The submarine claimed no attacks on Allied ships during a week in which the Admiralty had recorded 3 merchant vessels lost in its patrol area. The British explanation of those losses? Probable U-boat action. Yet the decrypt showed U-572 had been hundreds of miles away at the time. And it wasn't alone. 3 other U-boats listed in the area also reported no sinkings. Someone, somewhere, had misinterpreted, misreported, or misaligned the facts. The struggle unfolded as analysts attempted to reconcile these discrepancies. Historian and former codebreaker Harry Hinsley later described 1943 as a year when our understanding outpaced our records. Convoy logs, escort reports, and Enigma decrypts were all produced under immense operational strain. Yet the errors they revealed were too consistent to be dismissed as fatigue. In some cases, entire ships listed as sunk by torpedo seemed to have gone down without any verified U-boat attack. In others, German logs referenced sightings of convoys that the Admiralty insisted had not been in those waters at all. The Admiralty's official records from this period contain numerous entries like, "No German submarine positioned to carry out attack," followed immediately by, "Loss recorded as enemy action." The contradiction was glaring. But the war demanded certainty, even when the evidence refused to cooperate. Insight came from the analysts who had worked longest on naval decrypts. One of them, Lieutenant Emily Quincy, noted in a technical memorandum dated May 1943, "There are instances of ship losses where German denial aligns with atmospheric reports, convoy deviations, or navigational anomalies. Not every sinking is attributable to U-boats." Her memo, declassified only in 2015, hinted at the underlying problem. Some wartime assumptions hardened into official narratives simply because there was no time to re-examine them during operations. But the most sensitive issue involved operational errors. On several occasions, decrypted U-boat traffic showed German captains misidentifying Allied ships, sometimes mistaking escorts for merchantmen or vice versa. This, on its own, was expected. What alarmed the Admiralty was that Allied reports revealed the same problem from the British side. Ships placed incorrectly on convoy charts. escorts reporting contacts that didn't match known positions, radio logs containing time entries that contradicted navigational data. Much like the mysterious disappearances of earlier years, the inconsistencies pointed not to a supernatural cause, but to human and technological limitations under extreme stress. The reveal came during a closed Admiralty conference in July 1943. There, Naval Intelligence presented a summary of 17 cases in which official British loss reports were contradicted by decrypted German logs. In 5 of these cases, the Germans had recorded no submarines anywhere near the sinkings. In 3 others, U-boats reported fleeing the area after mistakenly detecting Allied aircraft that, according to Coastal Command, had never flown that patrol. The contradictions were astonishing. Something was wrong either with the German records, the British ones, or both. The Admiralty made a decision that would shape the post-war narrative. These discrepancies would not be disclosed. Not to the public, not to Parliament, and not even widely within the Navy. War was not the time to revisit earlier errors or expose weaknesses in intelligence coordination. Instead, the files were marked for restricted review only and sealed with extended classification terms. Decades later, historians would note that certain wartime loss records remained locked even after comparable files had been released. Modern analysts now view these inconsistencies through the lens of wartime chaos. Ships sank for many reasons: structural fatigue, storm damage, mines, mechanical failures, navigational mistakes, or collision, causes easily confused with U-boat attacks in the fog of war. But the Admiralty's secrecy about the mismatches created an aura of mystery that persists. By suppressing the cases, even if only to avoid confusion or morale damage, they unintentionally cast a long shadow over the historical record. The close of Part 5 brings the narrative to an uneasy pause. The deeper the Admiralty looked into unexplained losses, the more its own archives seemed filled with contradictions. The war was turning, yes, but so too was the internal understanding of what had really happened between 1939 and 1943. And as Britain prepared for the final years of the conflict, there was growing pressure within the Admiralty to keep certain files sealed, long past the war's end. For when peace finally arrived, some of these documents would remain locked away, fueling debates that continue today about what the Admiralty chose to hide and why. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world moved quickly to celebrate victory and rebuild shattered nations. But inside the Admiralty's secure archives, behind steel doors and thick paper seals, another story lingered, one far less triumphant. A cluster of files dealing with unexplained wartime losses, conflicting signals intelligence, and the mysterious incidents from 1940 to 1943 remained locked under special security provisions. As Britain transitioned into peacetime, these documents did not resurface. Instead, the Admiralty extended their classification, setting the foundation for an enduring debate among naval historians. What had truly happened in the Atlantic and why had so much of it been buried? The hook of this final chapter begins in 1946, when the British government initiated the massive task of reorganizing wartime paperwork. Millions of documents were sorted, catalogued, or destroyed. Yet an inventory sheet discovered decades later revealed a list of Admiralty files labeled sealed, not for public access. Among them were logs from HMS Auckland, fragments of the internal review on HMS Stanley, and the memorandum linking intercepted Enigma traffic to unidentified naval encounters. These weren't typical wartime intelligence documents. They were anomalies, records that didn't fit cleanly into the official version of the war. The struggle arose as naval historians of the 1950s and 1960s began requesting access to wartime records. They encountered unexpected resistance. Some files had been redirected to closed archives at Mount Wise in Plymouth. Others were reported as misplaced or pending review. The repeated delays sparked quiet frustration among scholars but drew little public attention. After all, the war's broader narrative was clear. Allied bravery, technological innovation, and strategic intelligence had overcome one of the most formidable adversaries in history. What difference would a few missing logs make? Insight came in the form of testimonies, letters, diaries, and oral histories that surfaced as aging veterans began telling their stories. A retired signals officer named Peter Chandler wrote in 1968 that he had been instructed during the war to withhold certain convoy records from standard filing. Another officer, Commander Malcolm Bryce, recalled being summoned to a closed-door Admiralty review concerning irregularities in wireless reporting from 1941 to 1942. These men were not conspiracy theorists, nor were they prone to exaggeration. They simply echoed a shared memory. Some wartime information was treated differently, more cautiously than the rest. The reveal came in the 1980s, when a limited batch of wartime files was finally declassified. Among them were internal memos revealing how the Admiralty had debated what to do with discrepancies between U-boat logs and British lost records. Some passages were blunt. Publication of full convoy records risks misinterpretation by future analysts, one document read. Another stated, operational errors must remain classified to preserve confidence in official wartime reporting. These were not sensational revelations, they did not confirm any dramatic cover-up, but they did expose the Admiralty's reluctance to acknowledge confusion and miscommunication within its own ranks. More intriguing were the surviving fragments of the files concerning HMS Auckland's Biscay damage and the disappearance of HMS Stanley. The newly released pages did not resolve the mysteries. Instead, they revealed how much documentation had been removed. Redacted sections appeared in the middle of sentences. Admiralty stamps marked "withheld" covered entire paragraphs. The missing content only deepened historians' curiosity. What was deemed so sensitive that even 4 decades after the war, it could not be shared? Modern reflection offers a sobering interpretation. Wartime naval operations were vast, chaotic, and often poorly recorded. Human error was inevitable. Equipment malfunctioned. Radios failed. Ships misidentified targets or misreported positions. A torpedo that struck unseen could be mistaken for a boiler explosion. A ship that foundered could be blamed on an enemy attack. None of this suggests anything supernatural or extraordinary, only the fog of war amplified by pressure and fear. But from the Admiralty's perspective, admitting to these uncertainties risked undermining a narrative vital for morale during the war and for national trust afterward. The application to today's understanding is clear. History is not only shaped by what happened, but by what institutions choose to preserve, emphasize, or conceal. The Admiralty's decision to lock certain documents away may not have been sinister, it may have been protective, cautious, or simply bureaucratic. Yet secrecy always invites speculation. By withholding records, officials created the very mystery they sought to avoid. The close of this final part brings us to the lingering tension that fuels the documentary theme. Some wartime records remain missing. Others exist only in fragments. A few, historians suspect, were deliberately destroyed. As a result, the full story behind several wartime disappearances and intelligence inconsistencies may never be known. What the Admiralty tried to manage quietly during the war now lives on as an enduring question. Were these gaps the result of confusion, embarrassment, or something more complex within the machinery of wartime intelligence? Today, researchers continue to comb archives in search of answers, piecing together fragments of logs, diaries, and decrypts. Each new discovery illuminates one corner of the mystery while casting another into deeper shadow. And so, more than 80 years after the war began, the Atlantic still holds secrets, not at the bottom of the sea, but in the silent spaces of documents the Admiralty tried, for reasons of its own, to hide.